Welcome back. This is our second of two vodcasts relating to writing an initial hypothesis, a beginning hypothesis. There's a lot of drafting it goes into polishing up your hypothesis, but sometimes you want to write a hypothesis under time pressure, often say 5 minutes of an exam. You need to get a hypothesis down and you need to get it down quick that doesn't leave out any of the essential elements. So the main emphasis of this podcast is to explore one method, not necessarily a great method, but one method that will allow you to create a quick hypothesis that you can then use as the basis for future drafting, basis for future refining. There's a lot more thinking that goes into it, but this is a starter. I'm going to use an analogy of a menu. Now, you're familiar with probably two types of menus. I'm not sure which one you think of first. You can have a menu on a computer or the menu in a restaurant. And so here are our two examples. Let's take a look at them. Each of them require some selection. Each of them require choices. If you tried to select everything on either menu, you'll cause yourself a few problems. If I tried to eat everything that was available on the menu from a restaurant, I think I'd find myself getting very, very unwell. Likewise, I think my computer would really struggle if I constantly clicked all of the different parts of the menu on a computer system. What have they got in common? Well, computer menus and menus in restaurants provide you with a range of set options. There are certain things that are mandatory. You must choose them. Okay? You can't go into a restaurant and completely disregard everything it has. You may modify it, you may make changes, but you do have to work from the menu that you're given. Some places actually have a set menu that tells you what your choices will be. Likewise on a computer, some items are mandatory. On the old version of Windows, you had to click start when you wanted things. If you want to access a lot of your files, clicking on My Computer is mandatory. There are some elements of the menu you can drop in, drop out, but some aspects are really, I guess, welded into the system, so you can't break them out. They are the set options you must use. Something we need to point out is that you don't choose everything that's on your menu. The combinations you choose matter. It does bear some, I guess, witness from people who are experts in restauranting that you're going to have a red wine with a red meat. You're going to have white wine with white meat. There are certain combinations you choose that matter if you're trying to improve the quality of your experience. So let's have a little bit of a look at what your set choices are when you're trying to create a hypothesis, because we've said there are some elements that need to be there. Firstly, you know you need to use the key words of the task. So they're part of your menu. Make a list of those words that you need to use that are in your set task. Likewise, you know you need to define a certain time frame. We are historians, we are concerned about events within the context of time. So we need to define a time frame. Likewise, a location matters. We need to define the geographic boundaries that we're studying, not just the time boundaries. Often, a good hypothesis is going to need a concessional clause, and you saw in the previous video how powerful some of those concessional clauses could be. It's interesting that concessional clauses usually are set up in the very first word of the hypothesis. So that's something to think about very, very early. Concessional clauses also allow you to have a lot more complexity in your thinking. And in your assignments, in your exams, we're after complex thinking. So really seriously consider having concessional clauses. Lastly, you might want to consider including a reason in your hypothesis. Now, this reason statement can come out in the form of a because clause, but again, you've seen in previous videos that not every good hypothesis has a because clause. So I've got that slightly below the others. Whether or not you have a because clause, whether or not you include a reason, largely depends on the task you're given. and you need to think about how that's done. So the quick tool we're going to create, I've referred to in the star on your screen, and that is we're going to learn now to create a simple menu for hypothesis writing. I'm going to give you a mock task, then we're going to create a menu from which you select words, and then we're going to see how a hypothesis could be created from this kind of menu analogy tool. The task that's been set for us in this particular vodcast is as follows. To what extent, how much, was the 1917 October Revolution in Russia a reaction against the Tsar's autocratic rule during World War I? Let's pause before we get started. Think about what the question actually means. Think about what the keywords are. Think about the way in which this task could be weighed up. Have in the back of your mind, does it look like you need a reason, or is it something that might benefit from a concessional clause? Now I wonder, if you drew up a table similar to the one that's on your screen now, perhaps you could create a menu from which you choose words. After you've drawn up that table, let's put in a few of the concessional clause starter words. Some words that we use as concessional clauses are, or starters for a concessional clause are, although. Very similar to although is even though. Words like despite, while and whilst, regardless of, in spite of. These are good concessional clause starter words. There are others. Perhaps you can put a few extras down. Maybe you can think of more. We need to make sure we've got written into this menu system key words of the task. Now, sometimes words of the task can be translated into word forms. For example, autocratic could also be autocracy. Reaction could be reactionary. We could talk about the October revolutionaries. We could talk about the 1917 revolution. There are other ways of putting it. We could talk about Tsarist rather than Tsar. We need to define a time frame. What time frame is given to you in the task? Certainly that would make the task sheet. But also we could use words that are synonymous to that time frame. 1917 is in the task. We know that the 1917, that year, is part of the earlier 20th century. So perhaps we could say that instead of 1917. World War I gets a mention. Are there other words we could use for World War I? The Great War, the 1914-18 war, the war to end all wars. Perhaps these are words that could be substituted in instead of World War I, but still carry the same meaning and define a time frame. The place in this case is pretty clear. It's specifically Russia. But we could sometimes name a country. We could sometimes name a region. Some countries can be referred to by different names. Britain can also be Great Britain, can be the United Kingdom. The United States of America can be America. It can be the United States. It could be just plainly US. The place can be defined. Make sure you define your place correctly. Russia could be Imperial Russia, but it wouldn't be able to be referred to accurately as the Soviet Union, the same geographic area, but with a different title because of a different time frame. Be careful of that one. At this point, you may have enough to write your hypothesis, but remember, you might also feel the need to put in a reason. There might be a need for a because clause, reason words. So, they include obviously the word because, but maybe perhaps therefore, however, words that can be used to lead into a new phrase that gives new meaning to your hypothesis. Let's now think how we would do this. Using that table, I now play a word game. I go from column to column, choosing words, joining them together, experimenting with how they fall that reflects the meaning that I have discerned for an answer from my research. So let's look at how I've put together a draft hypothesis, the first draft of something to be a lot of work based upon that table. My draft hypothesis is, although the Russian Revolution of October 1917 was led by many who rejected the autocratic rule of the Tsar, or Tsar Nicholas II, it was essentially a reaction to the ongoing hardships caused by the Great War. I've started with a starter word from the concessional clauses, although. I've got a number of key words in there. I've got revolution, I've got October, I've got Tsar, I've got autocratic, I've got reaction, I've got a synonym for the Great War, which is also giving me a time frame for World War I. I've got a time frame done in two ways. I've got 1917 and I have the Great War. Two ways of defining time. Russia, I've gone with the word Russian. I haven't chosen to use because clause, reason words in this case. That wasn't necessary. That should give you something to think about when you're doing your own work. I want you now to consider the task you've got in front of you. Draw up a table like this. Put in words that may help you and play that little bit of a word game to develop a quick initial hypothesis that you can then redraft, rework to come up with ultimately a very, very clear and succinct hypothesis that reflects your response to the task.